Welcome to a Pulp Event podcast, brought to you by the PulpNet, your link to the online world of the pulp magazines, for over 20 years, online at thepulp.net. In this Pulp Event podcast, Michelle Nolan, longtime journalist and pop culture historian, takes a look at a female pulp heroine, compliments of the Domino Lady. The talk was recorded on July 27, 2017, at PulpFest 2017 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania.
Good evening. I'm Michelle Nolan, pulp and comic historian, and the committee asked me if I would be willing to do a show on or a talk on the Domino Lady, and I said, well, I guess. I actually don't have any pulps with the Domino Lady in them, but they're very rare and expensive. And she appeared in 6 stories. The first in 1936, and the first 5 were in Saucy Romantic Adventures, which is, as far as I can tell, based on what's in various pulp rooms I've been in many times, not a very common book. You don't see it very often, and I suspect that it didn't sell very well. However, Norman Saunders did covers for it. So maybe I'm not giving it enough credit, because he was obviously, most people think he was the best of all the pulp illustrators, especially at getting the feel of a character. No matter what he did, whether it was Western or sports or detective or what, you could just feel the iron will of the character, or possibly the danger or whatever. He was amazing. And the Domino Lady covers, on the other hand, are more typical of the stories, in the sense that the stories were very tightly focused, very easy to read, because they were like novelettes or even short stories. And I'll go back to the Pulp Hero Index to start this. As most of you undoubtedly know, Robert Weinberg, and my brain is not functioning. I'm really tired. I drove hundreds of miles today. Who was the other Pulp Hero Index author?
Laura McKinstry.
Yeah, Laura McKinstry. I'm sorry, Laura, if you're here. Anyway, I just knew Robert so well, and he's been on my mind ever since he passed away. Those 2 fellows were easily, I was in awe of the Pulp Hero Index. This came out in 1971, I think, after at least the final version. And it had everything. We're talking about, it wasn't 100% complete, but darn near it. And it was so amazing to me that I knew almost nothing about, I knew a lot about comic books, but I knew almost nothing about pulps. And to see this publication devoted to all these wonderful heroes, most of which I'd never read by the early 70s. Doc Savage and the Shadow, sure, and the Spider, but not all those guys had incredible listings. But they didn't list the Domino Lady. And I didn't even realize they didn't list the Domino Lady until Bernard Drew put together an anthology called The Hard-Boiled Dames in 1986. And some of you folks might have that in your library. It's a terrific introduction to some of the series characters. And as I was reading through it, Carrie Cashin and people like that, I came across this Domino Lady story. And of course, obviously, I had no idea who Lars Anderson was. And Lars Anderson was purportedly the author. Well, it turned out that, and some of you, if you want to interrupt me, raise your hand, please, or just say something, because if I'm wrong, I don't want to spread the error. And I don't mind being interrupted at all. So, but Lars Anderson was the pseudonym of Thelma B. Ellis. And I tried to find out a few things about Thelma Ellis. I probably should have just called Will Murray, but because he doubtless knows more than I ever will. But Thelma B. Ellis was somebody who that's a real name. It was a woman who wrote several dozen pulp stories, mostly in the mystery variety, or the I wouldn't call it porn, it was more just tantalizing variety. And she appeared in things like Scarlet Adventuress and Paris Nights and all these other magazines that Doug Ellis did such a great job of writing about in his book. And she also turned up in a few mainstream magazines too. But for the most part, I mean, she really was probably maybe as little known as any author who ever wrote more than 50 pulp stories. I mean, just not well known. And I think part of that was because of the way the stories are, they're not, to be honest, they're not memorable. I think I should flip this over. Yeah, I'll explain this in a minute. They're not memorable because they're focused almost entirely on one or two events. You know, Domino Lady decides that she's going to go after this guy who's cheating the public, and her father was a murdered lawman, and a very, it was a lot like the Batman. And so she'll decide to go invade this guy's property one night or something. But that's all the story is. There's no second or third act. It's not like a Doc Savage novel which unfolds in endless chapters. And all the Domino Lady stories had 5 or 6 chapters, and that was it mostly. And so to read them, it's incredibly easy to read them because you don't have to remember anything, and the number of characters is limited. But essentially what the author was trying to do in 1936, and that's the only year the Domino Lady appeared originally, was to, I guess, introduce a female crime fighter. And she didn't really wear a costume so much as she wore a black and white, it could be either or both, cocktail dress, and a domino, over her. And you can see here Norman Saunders. This is the story, the Domino Lady's double, and Norman Saunders. This scene never appeared in the story, by the way, but Norman Saunders always had a way of putting the best elements on a cover. I mean, his work is magnificent. He probably is the artist who's probably even though he's well known because he was incredibly prolific in so many areas, but he's probably the most underrated artist in the history of American pop fiction. I mean, so many of the artists like Frank Frazetta and St. John and other artists worked with incredible characters and gained incredible fame. And Norman Saunders never, if it wasn't for his son, he would not have had anywhere near the credit he deserves. And David has done some amazing work in memory of his father, and not just his father, but multitudes of pulp artists. And anyway, this gives you an idea, this and the other one, let me flip back there, it gives you an idea of the light nature of the stories. I mean, they were violent and they were grim, but they were also somewhat light. And that's a little, okay. Now okay. I think that's not an original. Yeah, there we go. Maybe it is, okay. Now why did this, all right. Okay, never mind. Anyway, the one on the bottom right there puzzles me because I guess it's the one that goes with the story at sea, which is, I thought, by far the worst of the stories, so I didn't pay much attention to it, sorry. Anyhow, going back to female heroines, the Domino Lady represents, the only, and I mean the only, female costume hero of the 30s or 40s. Now, there was a Golden Amazon who was a science fiction character in Fantastic Adventures and other publications later by John Fern. And there was Jerry Carlisle, who was in Arthur Barnes' anthology Interplanetary Hunter, who was a 1940s big game hunter on other planets. And there were women of incredible distinction, but not Mary Marvel, not Wonder Woman, not Supergirl, nothing like Doc Savage, nothing like the Shadow. The Domino Lady has a little bit of the Shadow in her, not much. But essentially, we're dealing with a situation where apparently the people who published pulps and the people who wrote for the pulps didn't believe that a woman would sell stories. That a woman dressed in a costume or sort of a costume would be able to sell stories, a female costume hero. The idea just didn't exist. Now, the closest thing to the Domino Lady, and much more successful commercially, in the comics came about in 1941 and predated Wonder Woman by a few months, and that was The Black Cat, published by Harvey Comics. And she first appeared in a very little-known pocket-sized comic called Pocket Comics. And she appeared in 4 issues of that. Then she took up in Speed Comics, which was their flagship publication. And also she was in her own title for, I think it was 29 issues. And then they re-brought back a few in the 50s and 60s in reprints. But the Black Cat was very much like the Domino Lady. Her alter ego was Linda Turner, a rich movie star, and she knew judo tricks, just like the Domino Lady. She didn't carry a gun. The Domino Lady did do that. But they were somewhat similar. I often wondered if the person who created the Black Cat had read any of the Domino Lady stories. That's the closest thing to it. But can you imagine there were over 40,000 pulps published in the first 6 decades of the 20th century. And there are, if you don't count Sheena, which is I don't think is really a superhero, it's a jungle hero. To me, they're a totally different category. If you don't count Sheena, the Domino Lady, 6 stories. That's all there is. Now, Senorita Scorpion, I believe, had 8 stories in Fiction House's action action stories. But she, once again, was like a female Lash LaRue, but not really a costume hero although the covers were certainly dramatic enough. But I guess some people think of Senorita Scorpion as a costume hero. I tend to think of Western heroes that are costumed as more, a different genre, sort of a genre unto themselves. But anyway, the Domino Lady just is unique, and yet she totally failed commercially. Partly in her last story, which was her longest story, was in a title called Mystery Adventure Magazine. And that, I have no idea what that was, because I don't necessarily try to collect. I have a large pulp collection, but it's mostly romance, detective, Western, and sports. And I like genre fiction. But the expensive ones, I just had no idea what they were. And so I still find it amazing, especially when you factor in the heroes in the movies today. I mean, you look at the Marvel heroes, the female heroes and heroines, and you look at the Wonder Woman movie that's out, which is so spectacular. And then you go back to the comic books, and there's a common misconception there weren't many female superheroes. There were dozens. I helped a historian named Trina Robbins put together a book called The Great Women Superheroes. This was 20 years ago. And I supplied most of the data and all the art from my collection. And we spent 2 or 3 days at a copy shop. And she did a great job. She dedicated it to me as the girl with the most comics in the world, which is a joke on a character from the 1940s called Super Snipe, Copy McFad, who was the boy with the most comics in the world. But I still find it hard to believe that pulp, let me try one more here there we go. I still find it hard to believe that pulp magazines offered so little in the way of female heroes. And yet, the more I think about it, how many women bought pulp magazines that were not the love magazines? They fully 25% or more if you count the Western romance. 25%, maybe even as much as 30% of all the pulp sales and all the pulp issues were love magazines, or Western love magazines, and they sold almost entirely to women. And yet, none of those magazines had any daring heroines beyond being daring to grab a kiss or something. And, so the Domino Lady, when you read through her stories, it's very quick. You can read it in 1 or 2 days. The Rich Harvey Bold Venture Press did this compilation, and there's been a couple since. But this is illustrated by Steranko along with some. Now here's an original illustration of her, and there were several. There's another one. You can see that they drew her in a very sexy fashion. I'm not sure who drew her. There, now we're starting with the new pulp.
Ron Wilbur.
Huh?
It's Ron Wilbur.
No, I was talking. Yeah, right. I was talking about the the illustrations in the original 6 stories. I have no idea who drew those. Steranko drew the chapter separations here and did a pretty incredible job as usual. I'm friends with him, and I told him, I said, I really like your domino, and he had fun with it, because it was totally different. Somehow or other, he knew about the Domino Lady, but then Steranko knows about everything. Anyway, so I just still, to me, the thing I was wanted to stress was how unusual she was. Now, as far as what she did, Nick Carr in the Pulp Hero in 2004 features dozens and dozens of pulp heroes. And he also, and they're not all superheroes or costume heroes, but he does have the Domino Lady, Senorita Scorpion from Fiction House, and Sheena. And that's it. That's all he has. And this guy knew more about pulps than any 10 of us put together. And so he didn't miss anybody. Bernard Drew's anthology had 15 female detectives, and only one, the Domino Lady, was a costume heroine. And then some of the characteristics she had, I'm sorry if this is a little disjointed, but it's hard to talk about somebody who's that obscure and do it in any kind of interesting manner, because if you just do it chronologically, it doesn't work. She was a 22-year-old blonde daughter of an assassinated district attorney who actually, the way Thelma B. Ellis described Owen Patrick, her name was Ellen Patrick, and the way he described Owen Patrick might have been a more interesting character. He made him, she made him sound like Superman. I still think of Lars Anderson, and when you think, that, just to show you how impossible it was thought to be that a woman could succeed writing pulp fiction outside the romance magazines, they had her write under a man's name. And it never came out, to the best of my knowledge. I could be wrong about that. If any of you know, correct me. But I don't think I don't think anybody knew her identity until relatively recently. And I just don't know enough about what happened. John, do you know anything about how it came to be that people discovered her true identity?
Will Murray dug out stuff.
Will Murray, okay, yeah.
I don't know.
Well, I freely admit that Will Murray knows about 50 times. I mean, I like to think I'm a good comics historian, but Will Murray knows about 50 times more than I could ever imagine. And I have thousands of pulps, so it's just amazing. Anyway, she was the daughter of an assassinated district attorney or political figure. And the interesting thing about her is that she essentially was kind of she had like a utility belt, except it was a utility bra. And, and she would pull things out of her bra. I'll read you, this is amazing. And also her bag, her handbag. So, but then what woman doesn't have a handbag? But anyway, she said, I can just imagine, my purse is so messy, I don't think I could find it in time to rescue myself. The interesting thing here is this, it says, Ellen reached into the low-cut décolletage, can't pronounce that word right, of her evening frock, drew forth a shining metal ball, which rested snugly in the warm valley of her shapely bosom. Small and compact, it was a powerful weapon when properly used. It was a ball of poison gas, or knockout gas. I'm not sure how I should describe that. And she threw it at the villain, knocked him out. And then the other part of the same, this is from, excuse me, I should have said this first. This is from the Domino Lady Doubles Back, which is basically how she actually went back to where she stole a bunch of jewels to benefit people in orphanages. That was her favorite charity, was little kids in orphanages. And she was a Robin Hood in a sense, and she often did Robin Hood type things. She supported herself by, her father was wealthy, but she supported herself by essentially keeping part of the ill-gotten gains with the rationalization that she was stealing them from vile criminals, or as the author frequently said, vulpine criminals. Now, I have never seen the word vulpine used in any other story in my life. I'm not even sure that's a real word.
It means fox.
Huh?
Fox.
Fox?
Foxes are vulpine.
Okay.
So he's calling them fox, like
Thank you.
foxes.
Appreciate that. Yeah, I'm not very well. I mean, I've written thousands and thousands of stories, but didn't know that word until I read it in a Domino Lady. But anyhow, she loved stealing. She didn't kill any crooks in her 6 stories, and they made a big deal about that. Has the Domino Lady finally succumbed to the temptation of killing an evil man? But no, she didn't. She shot one a couple of times, but not to kill. Anyway, and then the other thing that's interesting is, unlike most costume heroes, she would disintegrate her gown and her domino mask when she was trapped. And here's from this Domino Lady Devil's backstory. From her wrist, this is after she has been apparently trapped. The tight-fitting creation came off her shining head, leaving her shapely body clad only in the lacy black scanties. And this is how she writes constantly. It's as though she's almost afraid to talk about women's clothing, in a magazine read mostly by men. Stooping, she wadded the black dresses and the domino mask into a small roll. This she placed on the floor near the wall. From her wrist bag, she produced a tiny vial of colorless liquid. The domino and the dress, of special construction and previously treated so as to take the acid, were doused with the consuming liquid. A tiny wisp of nauseating smoke eddied upward for a moment. Then the gown and the domino were nothing but a small pile of dark ashes. Now, never before, when I first read this years ago, never before had I heard of a hero or heroine disintegrating their costume to avoid being caught. Now, maybe it happened, but I've just never seen it.
Crimson Cloud by McClure.
The Crimson Clown did this by Johnson McCulley. Yeah, and what did he do, if I may ask?
Which one?
The Crimson Clown, you said?
Just took it off and sell it.
Okay, I believe it or not, I've never read. I have a hard time reading old literature, and McCulley has never appealed to me too much outside of the shorter Zorro stories in the 40s. Anyway, so he did the same thing. Okay, well, that's good to know. And then it said, before dressing, Ellen scooped these ashes up, sifted them into the wash bowl, a dash of water from the tap, and they had disappeared from view forever. Next, she reached for the costume gown. She was at a costume party, prepared to pull it over her shining head. Just as she raised it high, she startled. Someone was trying the door of the washroom. Okay, and then that was the suspense, and then of course she got away. But it was, the picture I showed before this one, that was from this story. So I just think it's amazing that the author tried to be that creative, and it was fun. Bernard Drew wrote in his Domino Lady, he called them escapades. They involved no investigation, no probing, no crime solving. Ellen has already zeroed in on the bad guy by story start, the main plot element, in fact, is the shapely heroine wrangling her way into a social situation, making lighthearted conversation, swiping something or other of value from someone who deserves to lose it, and dropping a calling card which reads, "The Domino Lady's compliments." And in all but one of the story, in one story she did not do the card, but in all of the stories that was kind of like a female version of the spider's symbol, when he would kiss the villain with the ring and all that. And but anyway, there are elements in the Domino Lady of, she's sort of a combination of everything. I remember in 1959, long before I ever heard of her, and long before, and 3 or 4 years before I first discovered my first Doc Savage pulp and sort of fell in love with the whole idea. I was 14, I read Doc Savage, I loved the code that Doc Savage lived by. They printed it in every issue, and it was so much fun. But in 1959, I had only read I was 11, and I had only read in 3 years of comic book reading and buying and trading and all that stuff about one superheroine. And I hadn't quite discovered Mary Marvel yet, but I read about, or the Black Cat, or some of the other characters. But I read Wonder Woman, and I always thought that was the greatest comic book on earth. Wonder Woman was unbelievable, the things she could do, and wouldn't you love to have an invisible plane? Well, and also I asked my mom, I said, "Mom, I hate high heels. They're so hard. High heels are a pain in the butt. And how does Wonder Woman run and fight crime in high heels?" And my mom said, "That's why they call her Wonder Woman." So that was an answer I've never forgotten. I can still hear her voice say that. But anyway, in the spring of 1959, I was at the newsstand. I was there every Tuesday and Thursday, faithfully, to get the new comics. And also my first job was, other than babysitting, was racking the comics for the dealer. So he would pay me in comics. And that was actually more money than you can imagine for a little 11-year-old. But anyway, I was looking at this issue of Action number 252, and there's Supergirl on the cover flying out, telling Superman that she has all of his powers. And I said to myself, "What's this? Supergirl?" Now, there had been a couple of Lois Lane fantasy type stories, and there was a prototype story the year before. So the concept had been used a few times, but Supergirl was the first regularly attempted, featured female heroine from DC. They had a few minor ones, but I mean, Wonder Woman, of course, was the first, but Supergirl was the first after that, and they were born, so to speak, about 18 years apart. So, but for me, Supergirl was the greatest thing that I'd ever seen. I just thought that was an incredible character. But the difference is, her stories were mostly one-offs, but there was a lot of continuity in there in the 60s, and they were different from the Domino Ladies in that they put more plot into a Supergirl story than the Domino Lady put into her stories. And most of the stories were 6 to 8 pages to start, and then they became 12 pages. But those stories, the Supergirl stories, were so much more complicated. And the Domino Lady stories were essentially, like I said, just very basic scenes. But she always found a way. In one story, the villain took her for granted, and she just did a judo flip of him and dove and rolled and got away. And I think the author was almost afraid to give the Domino Lady any real powers, And so I don't know what order these things are, so that's why. Yeah, I had a friend that I don't have a scanner, so a friend of mine scanned these for me. See the difference, though, and if you look at the originals and you look at these, I mean, this is almost typical of modern life. we oftentimes feel nostalgic for the old days, but the reality is, these versions of the Domino Lady are so much better than, and I understand, I'm not a new pulp person so much because I have limited funds, and I long ago told myself, and I have apologized to the new pulp people, that I could either buy the old ones or the new ones, but probably not much of both. And so anyway, I understand that there were the Moonstone books, Airship 27, of course, which you just heard from, and the late Ron Wilbur's erotic comics were big-time revivals of the Domino Lady. And so one Domino Lady story here is longer, I believe, than all 6 put together. And also, these are real stories. I mean, these are not little short stories with very basic focus. These are actually complex tales of, and from what I understand, they're terrific. And so I sometimes think that, I'm almost going to get in trouble for saying this, but I sometimes think the new pulp, when you can take an obscure character and create this wonderful image, I sometimes think the new pulp is better than the old pulp. And, that's why I kind of encourage people to give it a chance. But aren't these amazing? They almost, to me, they have the same kind of panache that fiction houses, comic books did with Sheena. Same kind of thing. Now that's a great one. Is that awesome or what? See now, okay. Now, doesn't this make you want to know this character much more than the original? It's amazing what they're doing, and I just can't get over how much better. Now, there's my book here. That's the cover. Now, that's Steranko, and you can always tell Steranko because he's really the master of thighs. You might think Frazetta was, but it was really Steranko. If he were here, he'd probably admit it. But that's a pretty cool cover, I guess that's it. But that's all the illustrations. Does anybody have questions or anything? What time is it? Can somebody tell me? I don't have a watch on.
10:48.
10:48. Okay, I started at. I just didn't want to overdo it. I'm running close to the edge here. I just wondered if anybody had any questions or anything about the Domino Lady. I didn't want to just go rehash every story, and just that kind of thing. But I encourage you, though, to pick, if you want to, you'd have fun reading them. And I don't mean to imply they're not worth reading, because they are. It's just that they're so much more primitive than modern stories. One thing about the Domino Lady that struck me is that they did a lot of rehashing of her history. But then that's fairly true of most pulp characters. But Doc Savage had a lot of rehashes in his books, too. But the Domino Lady had... One thing that was kind of neat was that she was so bold. They kept saying how much she thrilled to the chase and she thrilled to the capture. And her whole... I've always liked the Robin Hood legend, and her whole philosophy of life, because of the way her father died at the hands of evil men, was to make evil men pay and use the profits to benefit people who needed the money, including her. And I kind of like that. I kind of like the concept. And yet, the reality, of course, she was chased by the police in these stories. I mean, not in any given story, she wasn't actually, but the police were on her trail trying to capture her. And yet, one policeman in the story, I'm glad I remember to say this, one policeman in the last story, the Domino Lady Doubles Back, actually recognizes her and yet doesn't do anything to capture her. And she saves his life. He could have captured her. And he said, the Domino Lady deserves to stick around. And essentially, he was making a judgment call. And I thought that was great. The other thing that was interesting is there was a Domino Lady story, the 5th one, called Black Legion. And a lot of people don't know that in the 1930s, there was a rather sophisticated, sinister organization called the Black Legion. And one of the greatest movies Humphrey Bogart ever did is a relatively unknown 1937 Warner Brothers sociological movie called Black Legion. And it's about a man who throws away his life because of the hatred he has for minorities and people who, foreigners, immigrants, all of this. Very topical for today. But he hates blacks, foreigners, immigrants so much that he throws away his life trying to kill these people, or at least get rid of them. The Black Legion was like the KKK. It was a form of the KKK. And it wasn't as widespread over the country, but it did exist. And this story, Black Legion, the Domino Lady just captures a criminal, cleverly disguises him as the fellow they captured who was her boyfriend at the time. One appearance, her boyfriend. One appearance. Frustrating. The crooks who held her boyfriend that she rescued, they tortured the guy that she disguised, the criminal she disguised, and he wound up being tortured and actually maimed. Some of the stories are a little bit gory by the Domino Lady's switching of these identities. And she took great joy in the fact that this evil man got, it even says so in the story that she took joy that this evil man got tortured, that she found a way to have him get his just rewards. Apparently he killed her father, she found out. And so it's good. It's a good series, but it bothers me that the only female heroine in the pulps of modern day times anyway, in the urban environment, was so totally unsuccessful. And it's a frustrating thing. And I never did ask Bob Weinberg why the Domino Lady didn't appear in the Hero Pulp Index. And if anybody knows, tell me. But I just guess they just didn't know about her. So to me, that says, I'll just close on that. That says a lot right there about how women were so totally ignored by the pulps that the only female heroine in the costume hero variety wasn't even well known enough to make the Hero Pulp Index. But yet, since I love obscure stuff, and this was cool, and I said to myself when I first read it, I said, it's fun, but it's not very good. That's it.
You've been listening to a Pulp Event podcast, brought to you by the Pulp Net, your link to the online world of the pulp magazines, for over 20 years. Please visit us online at thepulp.net. Thank you for listening, and keep reading the pulps. The Pulp Event podcast is copyright 2017.